Hello and welcome back to another special edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Monday, January 23rd. It's a snow day, and we're back in the Zoom room instead of being in studio like we originally planned to have with our two special guests today, but I guess we'll manage. It's going to be great to have with us today Representative Seth Bongartz, who is, as all of you, I'm sure, already know, represents the Bennington 4 district, along with Representative Kathleen James. That includes the towns of Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and a part of Sunderland. And also great to have with us today Kat Bryars, who is the interim executive director of the Shires Housing. That's a nonprofit corporation that's been around in Bennington County since 1988 and helps to develop workforce and affordable housing in our area. And Kat, great to have you with us today. I think the last time you were with us, you were still at the Bennington County Regional Commission as the Director of Planning. So good to have you with us in your new role today. And obviously our subject is one that we have touched on before. I'm sure we will again many times, and that's the whole issue of housing. Major issue in the state, has been for a while. And we're fortunate to have with us today Representative Bongartz, who has introduced some legislation in the State House up in Montpelier that would attempt to work on that problem. But I thought first, Kat, just to get us started here, let's turn to you and have you tell us a little bit about Shires Housing. What does the organization do, and any major projects you've got working on at the moment?
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Andrew, for having me. And like you said, I'm so used to talking to you in terms of BCRC things, but I'm now solidly 2.5 months into working at Shires. So sometimes I put on my planner hat, which I'm lucky to still carry in my back pocket, but now also with a solid affordable housing hat. So Shires Housing, as you indicated earlier, Andrew, is the region, Southwest Vermont's nonprofit affordable housing developer. So the primary way that Shires delivers affordable housing in the region is to subsidize the actual development or redevelopment of housing. So we use tax credits and some additional, state-based grants to develop housing that is perpetually affordable. So the Shires portfolio currently goes from Bennington up through Manchester, also with residences concentrated in Arlington, Shaftesbury, North Bennington, and we have over 400 units that Shires owns. And we do property management of those units, filling them, working with tenants, maintaining them. Another big bucket of work that we do is resident services, and SASH is part of that. That's support for seniors to stay at home, basically try to extend the amount of time that aging folks can stay in their homes before having to, say, leave and move to like a supportive community. So we have, 4 or 5 full-time staff that are supporting people living in their homes. And that's actually where we get out of the limits of kind of Bennington County centric, and we provide resident services and SASH programming into Deerfield Valley as well. We mostly do rental housing as part of the affordable housing we provide, but just like a lot of similar organizations throughout the state, we've started to get into home ownership programs, and that's possible through subsidizing down payments, and Shires having an ongoing relationship in passing down subsidized down payments. Even if a home is sold in the future, that subsidy kind of gets passed on to the next purchaser. And so that's an exciting area of growth for Shires. I think in the future, we get a lot of feedback from communities in our region that the affordable rental housing is so important, and they want more opportunities for affordable first-time home buyers, starter homes. So we want to get into that. Just some current projects that we're currently working on and hoping to bring online by the end of this year and into 2024. We're excited about a number of community projects that we've done. So what Shires can do as an expert in housing development and management, we're often the people within the region that an organization that has a mission that can be coupled with housing access, they come to us and they say, how can you, as this entity with all of this experience and expertise, how can you help us do that? So 2 examples are working with recovery organizations in the region. So for folks recovering from opioid or other substance misuse disorder, we have 2 residences that are going to come online this year into next year in Bennington, one for women and women with children, and another residence for men who are in recovery. And we're working with Turning Point Center and V4, which is a statewide recovery organization, to bring those online. So again, they get to handle the programming aspects of those projects, and we handle the development and property maintenance side. So those are great examples of community partnerships that we're always looking to do. And yeah, we're also doing some improvements at our mobile home park in Bennington, Willows. It's just off of Northside Drive. We have some high efficiency, they're not quite zero energy, net energy mobile homes. We were trying for that, but those are still quite expensive. So we've got kind of the next best thing. We're going to bring 4 high efficiency mobile homes into that park with some funding, and there's actually a possibility we may be able to expand the scope, do even more on that before the end of the year. And we're responding to an RFP that the town of Manchester has put out for the property that they own on Depot Street in Manchester, and they're looking for developers. And I know there's a lot of folks who are submitting some proposals, but Shires will be putting in a proposal to do potentially a 30 to 40 unit housing development right in downtown Manchester. So we'll see how that all plays out. But those are some of the things that we've got rolling out this year and maybe into next year and beyond.
Wow, that's an impressive list of projects. Holy cow. I guess before we turn to Representative Bongartz and have him talk about his new housing bill, what are you seeing any common elements as to why housing is in such short supply here in Bennington County, as it is, I'm sure, elsewhere around the state as well. Indeed, this is probably a national problem as much as anything. But are you seeing any signs of that whole problem easing up a little bit, or is it still kind of stuck in a really difficult place?
I would love to say that I saw some signs of it easing up. I personally don't. You know, we're coming out of the pandemic where real estate prices, just went through the roof, and we're not seeing them come down. So the value of land, construction prices, competing for contractors, we're still really just at the height of that. And that's one of several of the elements that makes housing development challenging. Another one that, obviously Seth and his teammates up at the legislature have a focus on is our zoning regulations. And as a former professional planner, I'm very familiar with the ways that zoning can either be used as a tool to encourage housing, or it can be used as a tool to restrict, even if it's unintentional, restrict the possibilities for housing. So we still see that, although I think the awareness of the housing crisis we have, not just in Vermont, but like you said, Andrew, at the national scale, in recent years, more and more people are aware of that. And so I think that's really helping to turn the corner on development regulations and how those can pose a barrier. And there's more and more support for the kind of legislative reforms that Seth is leading. So that, I think, is a bright spot. Towns are really getting the link between housing and a vibrant community and economy. But I would say that too, I think some people we're always looking for a silver bullet in these things. And sometimes the development regulations, oh, well, if we can just fix those, that'll fix everything else. The housing problem is a fundamental market failure that, has a lot of prongs to it. So really high development costs, competing for labor and contractors and materials, that it's a perfect storm of factors that lead to continuing to make this a challenging problem to solve.
Well, okay, so perfect segue then to you, Representative Bongartz, and You recently introduced a new legislative bill that would attempt to incentivize more housing in downtown areas, downtown cores and towns. So tell us about it. What would this bill do? What is the goal here, and where does the bill stand at the moment?
Well, it's been introduced, and for anybody who wanted to look at it, it is H68.
H68?
H68. A few things to say, a couple preliminary. One is that the Vermont Housing Finance Agency estimates that at current trends, we need to build 40,000 units of housing for residents within the next 10 years. And we actually need it now. I don't know what the next 10 years is, but anyway, within the next 10 years. And if you start with the assumption that we're really actually going to try to do that, because for all the reasons that you and Kat have sort of hinted at, we are being held back economically. Teachers sign contracts, then they come, they can't find a place to live, and you name that times every other profession. Same thing's happening across the board. We have to solve this problem. And if we're going to build more units of housing, I would submit the only place that makes sense to do it is in downtowns. The alternative is in forests and farmland and sprawl. And so this bill there's a lot of things we need to do to solve if the word solve is possible, solve the housing crisis in Vermont. This bill doesn't attempt to do everything. What it does is, if there are a number of things, checklists, it takes one piece on the checklist and tries to check it off. And that is, in fact, as Kat alluded to, municipal zoning regs. Unintentionally, I always want to make that clear, but unintentionally having discriminatory impact, number one. And also, because they were, a lot of them were done 40, 50 years ago, they still have large lot requirements in downtowns, big setbacks, a lot of parking requirements, everything that was for a different era. And so what the bill tries to do, and by the way, towns are moving in the direction this bill is headed. And already what this is really doing is taking what might end up being a 15 or 20-year process to get everything cleaned up and move us over to where we need to be. Is just trying to do it in one fell swoop, get it done so that we can actually use the $300+ million of housing money that we've committed in the last year, a couple of years, and actually have it built, build the housing where we want to build the housing. So what it does is it says that in any area with sewer and water, the residential district with sewer and water, towns must allow at least 5 units per acre, which is actually a pretty modest floor as a practical matter, because there's 43,560, I think it is, square feet in an acre, and the footprint of the house might be 1,000 square feet, or something like that. So if you think about that in terms of an acre, and yes, there's parking and driveway and all that, but still, it's not that many. So it also says that in an area with that, you can also build a fourplex, up to a fourplex, so multifamily housing, and that's one way that you build affordable housing, or it's one way that you can build housing that is affordable to either lower middle income people. So the bill does those two things. It also says, it's called the by right provision, and what that provision says is that if you are allowed, for instance, under the zoning regulations, 5 units per acre, the planning commission or the zoning board who's ever hearing the issue, an application, cannot narrow it down below that 5. If you're entitled to 5, you get 5. Very often what happens is that because the neighbors really might not be happy about it, or about having 5 on that acre, it gets whittled down to 3. Or something like that. This says no. And actually what this really does is allow the zoning board or planning commission who's overhearing it to say, well, our hands are tied. We under state law, they're entitled to 5, so that's not negotiable. And that's a lot of the people I worked with putting this together think that that's the most important provision in the bill. But a couple other things for those areas that do not have sewer and water, there's two provisions in the bill that adhere statewide. One of them is that anywhere you can build a single family home in Vermont, you can build a duplex. So it's almost obvious that makes, to me, it's obvious that makes sense from a land use perspective. One foundation, one driveway, one set of services. You're really for no additional impact getting two houses instead of one. And that's just another way to help get some additional housing built. So anywhere you can build a single family home, you can by definition build a duplex. The other is that the requirement that towns cannot require more than one parking space per unit adheres whether you're in a sewer and water district or anywhere else. Because very often, excessive parking requirements make it harder to build housing. And we're trying to get away from, the use of cars for everything all the time anyway. So that doesn't mean, by the way, the developer can't do more. Because if you're in an area where the developer decides in order to sell the units, he's going to have 1.5 parking spaces per unit or something like that, that's fine. It's just that the towns can't require more than one. So there are other provisions, for instance, making it harder for towns to zone out shelters. And it says that towns cannot interfere with hours of operation or seasonality. In other words, if a shelter wants to be open 12 months a year, 24 hours a day, it can be, by definition, can't be negotiated down. So there's a couple of other provisions that I really like that aren't the headlines, that are studies tacked on to the end of the bill. We're looking for ways to make it more. By the way, so there are all these factors that make it hard to build housing, right? And some of them we can't control. We can't control the price of materials. We can't control the cost of labor. Although part of the problem with the cost of labor is there's no place for the people who want to build the houses to live as they build houses. So that's a little bit circular. So hopefully we're trying to break through that. But so if the thing we're trying to do is look at how to make it by easing the regulatory apparatus at the local level, you are making it easier for developers and less expensive, a little more certainty to go into the process. So that helped. That checks one of the boxes. But so the studies at the end ask fire safety to analyze whether we really need, in a building that's 3 or 4 stories high, with housing, a full-size elevator for a stretcher. Because that, we do that on the, because if somebody's on the 4th floor and there's a medical emergency, they can, rescue crews can come up and get somebody down on a full-size stretcher. Well, if you've got a modern staircase that's wide, you really can carry somebody down the four flights almost as quickly as you can go in the elevator. And so if you put in but of course we want to make it accessible, but what if you put in a half-size elevator, big enough for somebody in a wheelchair with an attendant, groceries, whatever you might want to get up there? The reason that's important is that the difference between a half-size elevator and a full-size elevator is the need to install 3-phase power. And that adds significant expense. So we're not saying this is or isn't a good idea, but it is worth looking at. So we want fire safety to really analyze that. The other one is, another one is, we talk all the time, everybody says all the time about empty commercial buildings, turn them into housing. Well, it's actually much harder to do than you might realize, especially commercial buildings, especially if it's on the 2nd or 3rd floor or something, because they were built to commercial codes. And the residential codes are so much stricter. And so we're asking them to look at ways to kind of reconcile that, to recognize that they were built under the commercial code. And are there ways we can, in those circumstances, we can tweak the residential codes to make it easier or possible to actually be able to build housing in those units, which does make so much intuitive sense. So, and finally, it asks them to look at whether if you're in an area with sewer and water and the building is sprinkled, whether we need a second means of egress. Now, the European code doesn't require two means if it's, under certain circumstances. and an extra set of stairs adds huge expense to a building and to a residential building. So again, it may or may not make sense, but my understanding, and I'm saying this without having done any research, so I'm repeating hearsay, but is that Seattle has switched to the European code, and when a building is more modern and is fully sprinkled, they're not requiring a second means of egress. And so all of these are just ways to look at, if we have this housing crisis, we're trying to build housing, and especially we're trying to build it in downtowns. What are some of the things we can do that maintain safety, obviously, but also can really help bring down expenses? So those are things that are kind of tacked onto the back of the bill, but I'm actually very curious about them.
Well, Kat, stand by, because I want to ask you what your reaction is to all of that and the bill and Seth has just described. But first, Seth, I just wanted to ask you: have you heard any pushback yet from towns that are kind of, let's say, like their local control and are very happy with having downtowns that are kind of less densely, constructed with affordable housing, and they're saying, "Hey, Montpelier, you're not going to tell us what to do in our town. Leave us alone. We're fine."
Well, that has been their traditional problem. I think that's changing because I really do believe that towns are kind of headed in this direction. And in some ways, this is just a push to move it along more quickly. And one thing I didn't mention is I didn't put this bill together in isolation. I put it together with a wide group of stakeholders over the course of the summer and fall. We went through, I don't know, 15 drafts of the bill at least. And everything from people at Housing Finance to VHCB, Gus Seelig and Trey Martin from VHCB, Katie Gallagher and Brian Shoup from VNRC, people from the department, from the Department of Housing and Economic Development. I am leaving out all kinds of people, but there are people who build affordable housing. Kathy Beyer from Evernorth, or what was Housing Vermont, and local planners, 3 directors of regional commissions, 3 EDs of regional commissions, and we were in touch throughout with the League of Cities and Towns. That doesn't mean they're fully on board, by the way, but we were in touch. But so will there be some of that? Yes. And there might be instances here and there where they're raising a point we didn't consider. That's what the committee process is for. What I tried to do with this was get this as far along and as carefully thought through as we could possibly get it. But what we were introducing was not some concept. Here's an idea. Why don't you go explore it, committee? We really did the work to really think it through, make sure that that it's cohesive, hangs together, and makes sense. But now the committee process starts, and some of those questions, which are probably going to turn out to be perfectly legitimate, will get asked, and maybe get shaped around the edges. For what it's worth, and I'll try to do this quickly. Keisha Rom Hinsdale, senator from Chittenden County, and I have been in touch throughout. And ironically, my housing bill, H68, is actually going to come to the House from the Senate because she is taking it and using it as the center of a larger committee bill. She's the chair of the Economic Development Committee. She's using my bill as a starting point, and she has then added some things around the edges that get to issues a little bit wider than we dealt with during our time. So, and the leadership has decided that housing is going to start in the Senate. So that bill will come over to us, but the provisions having to do with the regulation will come to my committee, and so we'll deal with H68 indirectly as it comes over as part of a Senate bill.
Interesting. Well, Kat, back to you then. What's your takeaway from the some of the ideas you've heard Seth describe here in this bill. Does it sound like a step in the right direction, or?
Absolutely. Yes, I can say with my hat on as an affordable housing developer now, and with my history as a land use planner, right on track, Seth. And the last question you asked Andrew about, well, what happens when we get community pushback? Inevitably, as Seth said, inevitably the community pushback happens. It's part of the process. Like Seth said, there may be aspects of this, there will be, frankly, that haven't been fully thought through, and so you need and welcome that pushback and observations and questions to really refine a bill to get it as good as it can be. At the same time, I think it's so interesting, Seth, talking about how the bill is going to be proposed in conjunction with economic legislation. I think that that's where we're really turning the corner in Vermont communities, is when people realize the inability to hire for even our major businesses in the region and statewide, the inability to, have our schools be filled. We don't have students because we don't have young families that can move to our communities. And there's real economic consequences for that. And when people can come back and see that one of the seeds of that is housing, and that one of the seeds of the problem, the barriers to housing development, are these development regulations. It's a educational process, a learning process that communities have been on now for several years. And I think you really are starting to see the tide turn, where people that maybe 2 years ago would have really objected strongly now really see, oh, this is why we have to grapple with these things, is if we want our future, our community to have a real economic future, keep our tax bills reasonable, we need more people, and we need employees at our businesses, and we need teachers in our schools. And so I'm really hopeful that that's kind of how that what we normally expect, really huge pushback is changing a little bit. I can just kind of anecdotally share, with Shires now working on this proposal to perhaps do a downtown residential development in Manchester. That site in Manchester that the RFP is out for now actually has 3 existing buildings on the lot, and they're 3 commercial buildings. And so Seth is absolutely right. And I'm, being new to the development side, am learning about this myself, but experienced developers can take one look at those buildings, and while it would be, seem like a very logical notion to take the second story of those commercial buildings and turn them into residential, you think that should be easy. And it's because of the need to then change from commercial code compliance to residential that the finances no longer work out. And I think maybe that's something helpful for people to hear, is just how difficult it is to make pro formas for housing development work. When you do see it working, it's pro formas that are often coming just down to, hairline numbers to be able to make it work. Again, as I stated, as a nonprofit housing developer, Shires is able to do it really through tax credit subsidy and grants. You even see at this stage, private housing developers are having to gain access to those resources too, because trying to make the numbers line up on these projects is just so difficult, even in the private market. So that's where somebody might think, but it's so logical, really, just the code compliance thing. If that's the thing that adds that much more cost to doing a project, it kills a project. And we see that all the time. So the example with Manchester, it wouldn't be a feasible project for Shires to develop residential in those pre-existing buildings because of that. But hey, if an outcome out of this bill were a study that indicated some ways to make those codes more flexible in the future, maybe in the future that would be financially feasible in a way that it's just not right now.
Seth, I want to go back to you and ask you what strikes me as being something of an elephant in the room here, and that's the whole question around why not add more Act 250 reform into this. It sounds like you may have an opportunity. I mean, Act 250 for a couple of years now has been mentioned as one of the areas that, this 50-year-old build that needs an overhaul, and that stands in the way of some of the housing projects that many people have said we need to have. Was it something you thought about doing, including some of the Act 250 elements?
A couple of things about that. And I've been asked that question a lot, obviously.
I'm sure you have.
One of them is that the people who build affordable housing in particular will tell you that Act 250 is not the issue. They will tell you that it's local zoning. So that's one answer. That local zoning is the key issue to get at for building more housing. The other is that my committee passed a comprehensive, and the legislature passed a comprehensive Act 250 bill last year that would have had a major impact in the right direction, for reasons that I think actually had to do with not understanding the bill. The governor vetoed it after we were out of the building, and we didn't go back and try and override. Having said that, Act 250, we need to make Act 250 do what it's intended to do. We need it active. I never use the word reform because that's code word for damage. But when people talk about Act 250 reform, they're not talking my language in any event. But I am interested. Act 250 is not working well right now. It's not as functional as it needs to be, and it's actually not doing the job as well as it needs to do it. So what I'm very interested in doing is spending my spring, summer, fall working on this issue with stakeholders. I'm already deep into this actually, and here's if you really want to back. So by the way, we didn't do it in part because the short answer is you can't piecemeal Act 250. Everything's connected, and everybody's always talking about a quick fix. Do this, and what else? You can't do that. Act 250 is everything's connected, and we need to comprehensively look at Act 250 and look at how to make it do what it's supposed to be doing and do it in a way that's efficient and effective and fair. And that's all fine. In fact, that's all necessary. Ultimately, we're getting into the weeds a little bit here, but if you back up to when Act 250 was passed 52 years ago, we really didn't have planning and zoning. And so Act 250 had to do everything. Now we have a lot of communities and more communities getting to be pretty sophisticated with their planning and zoning. And so when people complain sometimes about the duplication of the municipal review, then the state, then the Act 250 review, they're right. That I think that's a legitimate issue, a legitimate concern. So one of the things we need to do is think through which decisions should be made at the local level and under what circumstances, which decisions should be made at the regional level and under what circumstances, and which decisions should be made at the state level. Right now, it is a bit of a, it's a bit of a, I'll say disorganized mishmash of that. And so I am really interested in thinking through those big questions, again, with a group of stakeholders, and to come into next year ready with a comprehensive Act 250 bill. So that's the short answer. But the answer is just not exemption after exemption or quick fix and quick fix. That's not the way. That's not the way to make Act 250 work better.
Act 250 is one of those pieces of legislation that's been around for so long. I often assume everybody knows what it is, but of course, there's probably a few viewers out there going, Act 250, what's that? Yeah, what does that mean? State land use bill that was passed, I guess, prompted into, as I understand it anyway, by the surge of ski development back in the 1960s. So that's certainly no longer anything we're going to be terribly worried about, I guess. But I guess, Kat, back to you. Do you think, there's, I mean, every time I've heard about a large real estate project over the past 20 or so years, it always seems there's an Act 250 element into it. Like, somebody complains about a project and then it gets kicked up to the environmental court, and then the review comes back, and the best case scenario is it goes on for a couple of years, the costs go up, and the project becomes unaffordable, and the housing project never gets built. Is this something that eventually you think, maybe not as part of this bill, that Representative Bongartz is working on right now, but down the road also needs to be addressed?
Absolutely, and I'm glad we came back to it, because after I did my opening comments and then we turned to Seth, we really dove into focusing on local land use regulations, and Seth is right. I mean, that's the first barrier that developers are hitting. But I'm not going to say that Act 250 doesn't play a role. I think Seth makes an excellent point about trying to address it as comprehensively as possible. There's been a lot of ways through exemptions that priority housing projects like the affordable housing developments that Shires pursues are exempted from Act 250. But again, when you try to kind of do a patch job like that, it misses things. So, even just since I've joined Shires since the beginning of November, we've already had experience with a housing project that's in a downtown that the timeline for it was held up an additional several months because it had to go through Act 250. It really shouldn't be doing that because of all these exemptions that have been carved out, because it's in a downtown area, because it's a priority type housing project. But there's like an old rule under Act 250 where, since Shires is a major housing developer and we've passed this threshold of projects that we've done in a given area, well, we had to go through Act 250 for this project. So that it's an example of where, right, you can try to patch, but if you're not comprehensively looking at all of the barriers that are being set up, that have been set up in the past, and do they still have a role moving forward? Like, let's just go back through and see, is this meeting the intent from when it was originally put in? Because like I referenced the last time I was speaking, I had the mic. These projects, they're very hard to do. They're very hard to finance. Shires Housing is a nonprofit developer. There's not money sloshing around that we're, buying yachts. I mean, really, we just try to make projects break even. If they make money, we put it into the next development project. And that's how we operate. So when there's an additional several months time period, and any developer or even just a business person knows time is money. So you add an additional 3 months to a project between when you could have actually moved it to construction and now you've added 3 months, that can be thousands of dollars of funding that wasn't originally planned for in that project. So that's just one little anecdotal piece, but there's that element of, if an entity has done more than this many projects in a given area, oh, well, you want to do another one, you've got to go through Act 250. What's really the logic there? What is it that we're trying to achieve through a clause like that? And are we actually getting to that? Another example is the jurisdiction piece. And I saw this more working as a land use planner, that something that has an Act 250 permit, associated with it from the past, if you then go to update it in some way, there was an example of simply a sign for a business. And because that whole development had an Act 250 permit, that it had to undergo at least some level of Act 250 review by Act 250 staff just to change a sign in front of the building. And again, that's adding time, permitting, staff costs. There's just a lot of inefficiencies that, if we can look at Act 250 comprehensively, look at that full list of what's happening, that would be a great way to really make some big changes. Because I'm clear, Act 250 is not a problem. It certainly is, but I hear Seth's point that it's maybe not the biggest one, but one that we want to tackle in the coming years.
So one other question I wanted to throw at both of you was your reaction to the governor's budget address last Friday, in which he talked a bit about housing. I believe $80 million was one of the numbers thrown around, be drawn from ARPA money that would be invested in housing. I guess I was wondering if both of you could maybe bring us all up to speed on how there's already been a substantial amount of money invested from the ARPA funds in housing over the past couple of years, and 80 million sounds like a lot of money to sink into that again. What would all of that money do? What's it going to be going for? And do you think that would kind of begin to make a dent in some of the housing shortages we're seeing around the state? And Seth, maybe I'll go to you since I guess you were right there in the room when the governor was talking.
Oh,
What
I
did
was
he,
there.
did it make sense to you what he was saying?
Sure. That I think it added up to maybe I think it added up to 76 million or maybe 80. And it depends on how you count, things, but they were all kind of, it was 10 million here and 10 million there for some specific things. I think and I haven't really focused on each of those elements that he talked about because they were pretty quick. They were just ticked off as he went. Another 10 million for this and another 10 million for that. But I think the primary thing we want to do, and I think the legislature will be inclined to do this, and whether that means money from some of the things he talked about or not, I'm not sure, but it's to fully fund VHCB. I mean, that's just, if we're talking about housing, you fully fund VHCB. And I don't think that was that it was fully funded in the address, because it wasn't said that way. So I take it probably wasn't. We'll have to look at that, but we do have, I think right now, we fully fund VHCB. Some of the things that the governor talked about, like more money for I forget the terminology for the program, but for the program that helps middle income people be able to buy homes. We started that with $15 million last year. I think he talked about another $15 million this year for it. And I think that's a good thing. And that's it. It helps close the gap between the cost of actually building the home and what it can sell for. And so to help first-time home buyers be able to, middle class home buyers be able to buy homes. So that part I know makes I at least in my opinion makes sense. So we'll see. But the real thing now, and this is a place the legislature is focusing kind of around all of the programs and all of the ARPA money that has been committed. And by the way, we're going to have more infrastructure money to commit over the next couple of years, but is implementation. That checking on all of these programs that have been put in place and money allocated, and it's the legislature's job now to actually have the agencies in and actually find out whether everything we put in motion is actually happening the way that we intended it to be put in motion, whether new impediments have arisen, or whether they're doing it really well, or whether they're maybe not doing it as well as we had hoped it would happen, and then we'd have to figure out why. So I can't give you a detailed answer, Andrew, with exactitude about the 80 million, but those are sort of at least the key things that I'm going to be looking for and looking to make sure that we do.
And Kat, over to you. Any thoughts on what the governor is saying there last week?
Sure. I'm similar to Seth. I don't have deep dive answers on the different categories of funding that the governor outlined. But I'll say, and this isn't surprising coming from an affordable housing developer, more money would be great. I think we had a meeting of affordable housing organizations across the state, and when we really looked at the amount of funding that would be needed to meet the target housing development goals outlined by VHFA. Seth, you mentioned this earlier, how much housing we really need by 2030 to accommodate the demand that we're seeing. I mean, it's more like 150 million is what needs to be dedicated to housing to keep the current trajectory growth in housing going to meet the 2030 targets. But that said, we're happy to get what we can. And Seth made a great point, and I feel remiss in my to the extent that I still have my land use planner hat on, pointing to the infrastructure piece. We were talking at the top of the call, really, what are all of the barriers to housing development? And the lack of public infrastructure is just a huge barrier. So even when you're in areas that are adjacent to downtowns, really considered part of a downtown, that still remains a #1 barrier. Another project that Shires was exploring at the invitation of the town of Manchester, they own some land around where the town offices are. just northeast of town, and they invited us up just to walk the site. You know, what's really the possibility for adding some housing on this site. The number one issue is that there's no wastewater, and they've approved wastewater, but getting the funding to actually put the wastewater in place is huge. And you know, you're familiar with that area. It's really just up the road. There's actually sidewalks that connect that site all the way into the downtown Manchester, and yet there's not sewer. And so again, it's a little bit like the residential on the second story above commercial. Any person going by says, well, that's no duh. You know, you just put some residential on top of commercial. That should be easy. Or you have this publicly owned site along Main Street in Manchester, just a stone's throw from the downtown intersection. Well, obviously some housing should go there. And then you go a little bit deeper and you realize the code barriers, the infrastructure barriers. So hand in hand with funding that goes explicitly to affordable housing development, we really need to dedicate as much money as possible, encourage communities also to use their ARPA funding as matches to make infrastructure investments, because for every foot of sewer line or water line that a community lies down, that is just huge for having somebody like us, who we are called on regularly by communities. Hey, can you come develop some housing here? That's really what we're going to have to look at for, again, that financial piece to come together. Because if a developer has to develop their own potable water source on site or their own on-site wastewater, the cost of a project just is impossible. It's part of that public subsidy and an upfront investment that a community has to make. So that said, it's a big lift for communities. So when federal and state dollars are able to be put towards subsidizing that too, we're just in a great moment to be able to do that. And a planning study that's ongoing, Seth, to look at the impact of downtown and village center incentives and how effectively those are rolling out. You know, a lot of us are really looking at when, maybe Seth, you can remind us when that study is expected, but it's going to help us understand the incentives that have been put in place, just how effectively are they actually delivering things like new housing development. Can you remind me, Seth, when that's?
Yeah, it's July 1st of 23. That bill went to my committee last year, and we worked with Chris Cochran and people from the agency on it. And it really is the other way to put what Kat said about the designation programs is that they're a bit of a mishmash, and there's kind of too many of them, and it's not quite clear. So the idea here was to step back a little bit, look at the designation programs in a way from scratch, and see how they might be put together somewhat differently or streamlined or whatever. And because they were never intended to be regulatory in nature, they're more for grants on tax credits and things like that. But they're increasingly being looked at as if there might be, and I say this in a positive way, looked at as a means, an area that's designated be a place where the regulatory apparatus can be, I'll use the term loosened, I'm not sure it's the right word, but loosened a little bit. So so that's going to be a very interesting study. I know they had a little bit of a hard time getting the finding the right people to conduct it. And so it might, by the way, I think it's very likely that July 1st date is going to slip to later in the year, but it'll happen in 23. The other thing to note, along the lines that Kat was talking about with the sewer and water and infrastructure, and we should have touched on this earlier, is we've put, I don't have this number at my fingertips, but something like 150 million into clean water, which really is water and sewer for communities. And so there's a lot of room for grant applications right now. Arlington is working on trying to do the planning to be able to bring sewer into their downtown, sewer lines and water lines into their downtown. I think they probably have the water. And Manchester, that extension that Kat is talking about, that is actually there's bond allocate. The town has bonded for it already, but the numbers are so high, the town's looking for an additional grant from the state. And we've been doing what we can to help with that. So in a way, infrastructure money is also affordable housing money. That was the point I was going to make. And that is on top of the 300 or so million that I talked about over the last couple of years. We've also put at least 150 million into sewer and water infrastructure, which really is another way of saying we've put almost 450,000 into affordable housing. Not 450,000, 450 million. And I think more to come with the infrastructure dollars. So targeting this stuff right, getting it out right, and having it being used effectively. We really have, people have said this, been using this terminology that it's a once in a generation opportunity here, and they are absolutely right. And that might be even more than once every 2 generations. Yeah.
Well, there is so much more we could talk about on this topic. I feel like we've just scratched the surface here, but I'm afraid the clock is ticking, and we're going to have to leave it there for today. But Seth, we'll look to you to keep us informed and looped in on the progress of this extremely interesting bill. And I have a funny feeling we may be back in the studio, the real one as opposed to the virtual one, before too long, to have you fill us in more. And Kat, of course, I'll be giving you a call from time to time saying we need to have you up here to kind of give us the lowdown on what's going on, particularly that project on Depot Street. I know that's been of great interest to us up here.
Absolutely.
But I guess we'll have to leave it there. And again, I wanted to thank Kat Bryars, who is the Interim Executive Director of Shires Housing. Representative Seth Bongartz is a member, I should have said this right at the very beginning, of the House Committee on Environment and Energy. Seth, thank you for making the time for this call. Thank you both for making the time for this call and for sharing your views on this very important subject, which, as you both mentioned, has interconnections across so many things: workforce, childcare, the economy as a whole. There's just so much involved in solving the housing problem here in the state. So thanks again. And thanks to all of you who've been with us.
Thanks to GNAT for doing this. We have to be careful never to take GNAT for granted, because you do an amazing job connecting the community. So thank you for that.
Well, you guys are the ones that make it all happen. So anyway, we'll see you all again the next time.